This is one of the greatest disasters of the 20th century, and few have even heard of it. How do you turn the world's fourth largest lake, a natural reservoir that sustained many countries and regions, into a desolate, toxic wasteland? Well, after decades of mismanagement, the Soviet Union found a way. Before 1960, the Aral Sea was the fourth largest lake on the planet, covering almost 67,000 square kilometers and providing food and employment for hundreds of thousands in Central Asia and millions across the Soviet Union. In the 1950s, the lake provided a full tenth of the Soviet Union's fish and was a defining feature of the Central Asian landscape. Now though, after what the United Nations Development Programme called the most staggering disaster of the 20th century, things are very different. The sea that was once teeming with fish and people is little more than a barren desert with swirling clouds of toxic chemical dust sweeping over the people that still live on the border of the old sea. The fishing fleets that used to ply the waters now sit abandoned in the sands, still moored to the docks that have long since seen their water disappear. As for the millions that once relied on the lake, well, they've been left behind. Cancers and sickness ravage the region as the waters that once fed the lake are diverted to feed the farms built by the Soviet government more than half a century ago. Hello, time travelers. I'm your friend, Mike Brady, and this is the story of how greed and cotton ruined the Aral Sea. The Soviet Union was a vast, sprawling superpower, but its center of power had always been over in the West, where big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg flourished. And this was where the majority of the population lived, where the capital was and where the most productive lands were. But despite the relative prosperity of the West, things were very different over in the East. The lack of development in Central Asia was a major sticking point for the Soviet government. And in 1959, they came up with a plan that would revolutionize the region. The plan called for increased attention in the east. The area around the Aral Sea would become a major agricultural hub through a vast irrigation project that would fertilize the fields of Uzbekistan. Cotton was landed upon as the perfect thing to grow in the region, as the climate was suitable, it was a versatile and valuable crop, and it could be used within the USSR, but was also suitable for export. Work on the irrigation project began soon afterwards. By the 1960s, the first of the Uzbek cotton was being grown, watered by the rivers that once fed the Aral Sea. Now the issue is that cotton requires a massive amount of water to grow, and in order to irrigate the Central Asian cotton fields, the Soviet Union diverted the course of the Aral Sea's main tributary rivers, the Amu and the Syr. Now, this was successful for a time. In the 1980s, Uzbekistan became the world's largest producer of cotton. The local economy shifted entirely towards the production of the crop, and to this day, cotton is a major export of Uzbekistan. The growth was massive. In just 20 years, Central Asia's cotton production had reached over 9 million tons annually. The USSR was driven by a desire to become the largest producer of cotton in the world, never mind the consequences. But then something disastrous started to happen. The Aral Sea was disappearing before the eyes of its people. The diverting of the rivers had deprived the lake of the water it needed to survive. It seems shocking, but the vanishing of the Aral Sea was not a surprise to the Soviet government. It was fully understood at the time that the rivers they were diverting provided the overwhelming majority of the water in the lake, while rain would not give nearly enough to maintain the water levels. Now, they knew the canals would cause a drastic drop in the water level and eventually destroy the lake entirely, but despite these issues, the Soviets continued with the plan. Growing the economy of Central Asia with a valuable crop like cotton was considered worth the cost of destroying the lake. The fishing and the ecology of the region was simply the sacrifice that would have to be made. What the Soviets didn't count on, though, was the sheer scale of the disaster they were setting up. They thought the worst that could happen was that the lake might simply dry up, but they were horribly, horribly wrong. To add insult to ecological injury, the canals that were dug to divert water from the Aral Sea weren't even particularly well made and had massive water losses through evaporation and soaking into the desert. Now, the exact amount of water that was lost can't be known for sure, but modern estimates put the canals dug in the 60s as losing between 25 and 75% of the water that was diverted, depending on the time period. The Kara-Kum Canal in Turkmenistan is built entirely atop loose sand that the water simply sinks through. Now, this meant that the sea was losing 4/5 of its contents, but if things had been only a tiny bit better thought out, it might not have been in vain. If they had used better built canals, they would have been able to grow the same amount of cotton with far less water, and the sea might have survived for longer. The Soviet government also insisted on running the agriculture from a central bureaucracy in Moscow, meaning that the farmers were unable to or unwilling to fix the issues with the water themselves. Poor farming practices were implemented in the name of large yields and in a quick manner. Toxic fertilizer was run off from fields and into rivers, and there was no long-term plan for dealing with soil depletion. The cotton fields would simply leach all the goodness out of the ground before the farmers would just then move on. The land was being bled of whatever it had to offer. All of this greed, bureaucracy, and poor planning had an immediate and tragic effect. The water levels began to drop, first slowly and then dramatically. It was exponential. The drying lake warmed the area around it, and the more water that was lost, the faster the remaining water evaporated. By the 1980s, Soviet cotton wasn't even making much economic sense anymore. It would have been cheaper to simply import what they needed from friendly nations, but the wheels of the Soviet government turned excruciatingly slowly. There was barely any reaction from the governing body, and when at last they did react, production was hardly even reduced from its normal rate. By 1998, the water level of the Aral Sea had declined by more than 20 meters, and it covered a mere 10% of the land that it had covered only 40 years before. From this point on, the water level has stayed largely stagnant. The little that remains is divided into two lakes, now called the North and South Aral Sea. When the Soviet Union itself collapsed, the irrigation projects were never abandoned or shut down. Cotton became a staple of the Uzbekistan economy and couldn't be abandoned in such a turbulent moment in history. As such, the situation today is much the same as it was under the Soviets. The rivers feeding the sea have stayed diverted, the lake has sat stagnant, and the people of the region are in just as bad a position as they were decades ago. In fact, probably it's worse. The dust from the dry lake bed has spread beyond the boundaries of the old lake, and now it's slowly creeping out, threatened to turn the homes of millions of people into a barren desert wasteland. Though there may be some water left, to say that the lake is a husk of its former self would be a serious understatement. There is a fluctuating number of smaller bodies of water that might appear seasonally, but it's nothing when compared to the sea in its natural state. The South Aral Sea is an ecological dead zone in any case because the drop in the water level has resulted in a massive increase in salt levels. The salt level would be fine in a lake the size of what the Aral Sea used to be, but now all that salt has concentrated in what little water remains. The fish can't even survive in the water. The salinity is 10 times higher than it was when the lake was in a healthy state. The effects of the Aral Sea drying have been absolutely devastating. Now, not only have the once vibrant communities in the region been deprived of what was once their greatest resource, with fishing communities now stranded in a barren desert, not only has an entire ecosystem been destroyed that once made up one of the greatest inland marine systems on Earth, but those people that remain in the proximity of the Aral Sea are now faced with issues that one might have never expected. The dried out sands at the bottom of the lake are now releasing salts and pesticides into the air, kicked up by the winds that now ravage the area. Chemicals that had been dumped in the Aral Sea in the days of the Soviet Union are now being released up into the atmosphere. Everything from the remnants of biological weapons testing to industrial fertilizer was resting on the bottom. And these chemicals now form the basis of a toxic dust storm that continues to plague the area and its people. This toxic dust has caused a drastic spike in cancers and respiratory issues in the surrounding area. The farms growing food in the region were also abandoned under Soviet policies. It was thought that the Central Asians could simply import the food they needed from other parts of the Union. Now, this mostly worked until the 1990s, when the newly independent countries had to find their own food. The most fertile land is still used for the production of cotton, instead of locally grown food. So now malnutrition and infant mortality have skyrocketed. Pollution of the remaining water has reduced access to drinking water as well, and the conditions in the area are almost post-apocalyptic. The constant drainage of water has also resulted in desertification, with the dead zones spreading out from the Aral Sea into other areas. The salt dust that flies off the dried lake bed, killing off surrounding soil and poor water usage, prevents new plants that might mitigate the damage from taking root. Well, as for the cotton fields themselves, you'd be surprised to learn they're still functioning today in the same way as they were in the days of the Soviet Union. Cotton forms one of Uzbekistan's most important exports, and the government has been incredibly reluctant to do anything that might damage the industry. The cotton fields today are notorious for human rights abuses, with hundreds of thousands of forced labourers being sent to the fields every year by the government. And some of these people are children. In 2013 alone, over 13 people died in the cotton harvests, including one boy who was only 6 years old. The issues surrounding the Aral Sea were obvious to virtually everyone that looked, but thanks to Soviet bureaucracy and the allure of cotton production, nothing was ever done. In the 1980s, even the Soviet government itself was beginning to see issues with allowing the lake to dry. The only problem was, no one quite knew how to deal with the problem in a politically useful way. Plans were briefly proposed in the Brezhnev era to divert Siberian rivers to the Aral Sea, and this would allow both cotton production and the restoration of the lake, but those plans were thought to be simply too expensive, and by 1986 they were shelved. This was the closest that the Soviet government would ever get to acknowledging the monumental ecological impact that their system had had. In 1997, the United Nations and World Bank conducted a study of the region, trying to find a solution to the crisis, but the report was grim, eventually concluding that, while there was scope for reducing the wasteful use of water, the savings would not be enough to change the desiccated sea. It seemed that the damage done in pursuit of cotton would remain permanent. Now, more recently, there has actually been some good news though. In Kazakhstan, the North Aral Sea has seen some successes in being restored. The government has accepted responsibility for undoing the damage done, and in 2005 completed the Kokh-Aral Dam that would help restore the water levels of the North Lake. Now, while it's not managed to save the Aral Sea as a whole, this project has seen great success. The water level in the North Lake rose by more than 3 meters after only 7 months. The North Lake is expanding, while salinity is dropping. The fish population is also rising, and the wetland ecosystem surrounding the area is experiencing a slow recovery. This has allowed a shift in the area back to traditional fishing communities and away from the resource-intensive agriculture. Uzbekistan, unfortunately, has not attempted anything similar. The region is too reliant on its cotton crop, and to divert water back to the Aral Sea would be to deprive farmers of the water they need to grow their cotton. Uzbekistan, to this day, remains the world's 5th largest exporter of cotton, despite the massive and clearly visible damage the crop is having on the region. For now, it would appear that the majority of the Aral Sea will remain nothing but a dried out husk of what was once a vast inland sea, a natural marvel, and one of the largest lakes in the world. Hello time travelers, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, leave a comment below and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, remember, history doesn't repeat, but it certainly echoes.